Going to start off with a little bit about us. My name is Brian Albright, and I am a manager of the Quality Center of Excellence at AppDirect. And Darpan here is a senior staff engineer on my team. We work to develop best practices for tooling, automation, and testing within our organization and help provide broad platform tests that all teams can rely on. So getting into what we're on today, I'm going to start with some key concepts that many of you probably already are familiar with, including identity providers, two-factor authentication, and Mailosaur. We're going to then jump into look at the actual user journey we're going to be automating, and we'll look at that approach to automation, and then ultimately we're going to dive into some of the Cypress commands we're leveraging, some of the custom commands we're leveraging, and the Mailosaur plugin that we'll also be using. And then after some of this overview, Darpan's going to jump into the code and give everybody a demo of this working live. So let's just start with what is an identity provider. So identity providers are services that create, maintain, and manage identity information for your users. So everybody here is probably familiar with login with Google, login with Facebook, and these kind of things that are identity providers that you already have an account with, and they'll already know who you are. So they really help managing and maintaining the different user information, and also can help import that information into your application without having to go through kind of complex onboarding workflows. They really simplify the onboarding process and that login process. But at the same time, you don't really manage that system. Next up, we're going to look at two-factor authentication. This thing that probably everybody is a little bit annoyed by, but everybody uses because it's more secure. It's a security method that, as the name says, requires 2 steps to verify your identity. First a password, but then a second method like SMS, an email, a hardware token, or apps like Duo or other things that try to ensure that hackers can't access your account simply by knowing your password they may have gotten from a data breach or something else. So the last real component here is Mailosaur. So what is this? Mailosaur is a SaaS solution that enables end-to-end automation that involve email and SMS flows pretty much through APIs. And this is really great because normally when you're looking at SMSs, you need a phone, or you need it's hard to get a code that you're texted into your program to continue your automation. These two-factor authentication is kind of designed to stop robots from doing these kind of things. So how do we beat that mechanism with our own robot? And the answer is SMS plugged into a robot. So Mailosaur helps us provide this. It provides APIs for interacting with SMS and email. It provisions phone numbers. It provisions emails for you. And it really makes this otherwise human process something that we can actually implement in a Cypress test. So digging into what we're actually going to be doing, we're going to start by using our first-party application in Cypress, and we're going to be logging into a third-party identity provider. This results in us being taken off platform to another origin to complete the authentication flow, and then ultimately back to our own application. In this case, we're going to be using one from ADP, and after we enter our credentials, we're going to be asked for a one-time password for the two-factor authentication, and we'll be ultimately redirected back to our application as our fully authenticated user. So we've got a couple of different touch points in here. We need to take advantage of several of the built-in and custom commands we have. We're going to be using cy.session, cy.origin, cy.intercept, and as custom command cy.mailosaur get message to facilitate different parts of this workflow. So just a little bit of rundown of these commands specifically. Cy.origin allows us to visit and interact with different domains within a single test. Many of you probably already know that one of the sort of limitations of Cypress is that you have to stay within the same domain within a test. But cy.origin gives us the ability to visit a different domain external to the initial one and complete test flows within that origin, and then ultimately return back to our application, our web page. And this is required since we're leaving our own our own space, our own domain to authenticate and come back. Cy.session here is really helpful to cache these credentials and cache the authentication information that we need. So as we're running through a whole suite of tests, that we don't have to continue, keep getting SMSs during every test. We don't have to keep logging in and going through this cumbersome workflow during every test. And as we also know, email and SMS aren't necessarily deterministic workflows, so they may not always come in exactly when you want them to. So reducing the risk there by only going through this flow once early on at the start of your test, and then using that same credentials throughout the test really reduces the kind of flakiness and problems within the test. In one of our larger test suites, using cy.session helps our test suite save about 40 minutes of execution time across about 85 different tests. Lastly, we also use cy.intercept to capture cross-site request forgery tokens that we need to continue to, we need to log into the third-party IDP so that they know that, as we're redirected to their platform, that we're not a hostile actor either. cy.intercept is a very powerful command that lets you modify requests in flight, stub responses, and you can trigger exact behavior with your APIs and interactions that you want. And in this case, it also allows you to extract tokens from the request headers and the request payloads that you might need to use later on in your workflows. So the last real component here that we're going to be working with is the Mailosaur plugin. So this is provided by Mailosaur, and it gives us access to some helpful commands like Mailosaur get message, which this allows us to call the Mailosaur API and get one-time passwords from, in this case, I think SMS or email, and then provides easy access to that such that we can pull that into our code and then submit that into the challenge response for the to complete the login flows. So with all that, I'm going to hand this off to my esteemed colleague Darpan, who can present this workflow in action.
Thank you, Brian, for the great overview of identity providers, Mailosaur, and Cypress commands. Now let's dive into the implementation details and see how it all comes together. Let me share my screen. Perfect. So first, let's start by looking at how to integrate Cypress with Mailosaur. Like any other dependency, we need to install and import the Cypress Mailosaur module. And you can simply install the module by doing npm install Cypress Mailosaur. Once the module is installed, it will be displayed under dependencies inside the packet.json file. Then we can import the module inside an e2e.js file by adding an import statement. And finally, to connect to the Mailosaur server, we also need to set up Mailosaur server ID and Mailosaur API key as environment variables. You will get those from Mailosaur dashboard. And that was it. Now we can start using Mailosaur commands. Here we have created a Cypress custom command called getOTP. This command calls the Mailosaur get message function to fetch the one-time passcode sent to the given phone number. It also uses a received after to ensure the one-time passcode is latest. Now let's use this command in a test.
Hey, Darpan, can you zoom in one or two ticks? We got a question there.
Oh, for sure. It's good now?
That's good.
Perfect. Yeah. In this test, we call the getOTP command with necessary parameters and assert that the code received is 1122. Let's run the test and see the results. As you can see, the test executed successfully. It called the Mailosaur API and fetched the code 1122 just as expected. Now let's dive into the details of how we can use Cypress Origin, Intercept, and Session APIs all together to automate the complete IDP workflow. Here we have created a login function for the IDP. We have defined all the IDP host, URLs, and endpoints. We also have a placeholder for Storica token that we will be capturing later. Here is our first intercept, which extracts the token from the response headers of the CSRF request. Here is another intercept, which updates the matching signing request headers and adds the correct XSRF tokens. Sorry, here are the commands to visit the home page and click on the login button on the primary domain. And as we click on login button, the domain changes to the IDP domain. And to interact with the IDP domain, we need to use cy.origin. And here we pass our IDP host along with the all required parameters that we need for the interaction with the IDP host. We also need to import our Mailosaur command file here, because in the origin block, we need to explicitly import dependencies. And to allow this, we also need to enable experimental origin dependencies to true in the config. Then we can start interacting with our elements on the IDP. Here we are entering username. We also enter our password. The condition here we can see for the path name is like in our ADP IDP, it's not always that it will ask for an OTP, right? So we also check for a path name. It's the path name is for the OTP. We call the get OTP command and fetch the OTP from Mailosaur and then enter on our IDP screen. And finally, we use our session APIs to cache the session. And we also have added a validation for our session by calling an API and make sure the session is completely validated. If the session fails after it's created, the test will fail. If the session validation fails after the restore, the session will be recreated. The cache across specs, when set to true, will cache the session across all the specs for the test running on that particular machine. If you are running in parallel, it will do for each machine. Now let's use this whole login function into a custom command called login as manager. Now let's look at the test where we use this function. So here are two very simple tests that visits the page requiring user to be logged in. Let's go ahead and run this test and see the complete IDP workflow in action. So as you can see, it has started in the session, and notice the domain currently it's an appdirect.com. And once it will click on login, it will redirect to adp.com. Yeah, the domain changes to adp.com and it enters the username password. Now it will fetch the code from Mailosaur and submit it. Once the user is authenticated, the session will be marked as created. So we can see it almost took 35 seconds for login. It's executing our first test. And now it's executing our second test. And we can see the second test did not authenticate because it restored the session. So here we can confirm it. So for the first test, it created the session and it also validated the session. And for the second test, we can see it has restored the session as well as validated the session. We can also check that the tokens were correctly passed in the intercepted sign-in request. We can see initially it was passing undefined, but after stubbing it, it had passed the token correctly. Yeah. Yeah, and that brings us to the end of the demo. We have seen how easy it is to automate the IDP workflow using Cypress and Mailosaur. Thank you all again for your time. I hope you found this session helpful, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Thanks, folks. That was a great presentation and a great demo. Thank you for walking us through that. I have a couple of different questions from the audience I'm going to be bringing up on screen. And the first one is a question about the specific implementation of the test that you just ran, Darpan. I'm going to share the screen. Richard was looking for some more information on how the test was able to know that the number would be 1112.
Oh, that's just for the demo, right? Just because I want to show the integration works, I explicitly sent the number 112 from my phone, my personal number to Mailosaur, and just for the demo purpose, yeah. Ideally,
Gotcha.
we don't validate the OTP, right? Because it's always the new unique one. That's why when in the end-to-end test, we got a different number, right? Because that was the latest Migrate test passcode that was received. This was just for the demo, hard-coded one, just to test the integration is working.
Excellent. Thanks for that explanation.
Yeah.
I have a couple more questions going on to the next one. When tests using Mailosaur API fail in CI/CD, what is the best way to debug those failing tests?
If it fails, you will get the failure message in a Cypress console logs, right? And you will be able to identify what actually caused the failure. Personally, I've never seen Mailosaur API failing in CI/CD. And as we use session, right, you don't log in often, right? It's just like once a test, once per run. It's very unlikely to fail. But if it does fail, it will show an error in the Cypress console itself because it's integrated with Cypress.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and go on to our next question. And this one is more about implementation for Mailosaur and kind of what you need behind the scenes. So for the Mailosaur plugin, do you need a physical email server to exist, or does this work with containerization as well?
Yeah. So when you enroll for Mailosaur, right, they provide their own server ID. So here we see we have passed the server ID, right, as an environment variable, right? So we create our own servers on Mailosaur dashboard, and they provide us an email with an email IDs, right, that we can use and forward our emails to. So you can create as many as server you want, but that's provided by Mailosaur. There is no physical server. It's from Mailosaur.
Excellent. Our next question that I'll share over here to the screen is about encryption. So what encryption methods do you use to keep from exposing actual user data?
And this is in regards to Mailosaur?
I believe so, yes. We have David Hurd is our question asker. So David, if you have any more context you want to share in chat, go ahead and post it over there.
Yeah, because from Mailosaur side, I don't think we expose a lot of actual user data because the accounts we use are mostly test accounts. So they don't, they are not like real customer data, right? We just use those for our test accounts.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Brian, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I was going to say for like the login credentials, and the team that's developed kind of the login does the security for like the the username password. We're not just passing plain text, but that's somewhat out of the scope of the test itself on obfuscating that information. But we also make sure not to log that data in cy.log or anything to make sure that the sensitive information isn't written to Cypress Cloud.
Excellent. Another question from the audience kind of focuses on maybe a bit of a different implementation here. So I will go ahead and show this to the screen. For instances where in this kind of authentication workflow, you're having to wait for email messages to arrive. Do you guys have any recommendations around that, since sometimes they can take like 5 to 10 minutes to be delivered?
So when we say, as I showed, right, when we use this received after write, so there is a timeout too we can set. Here it's like 30 seconds timeout. If we don't want to wait for more than 30 seconds, the Mailosaur will time out, the connection will time out and it will throw an error. But if it might take more than 5-10 minutes, you can increase the timeout. But ideally, it's super quick. And I've never seen it taking more than 30 seconds to get a SMS or emails in our case. But it depends, right? Depending on different conditions, right? So Mailosaur has all the options that you can use for timeouts and other configs.
Awesome.
Yeah, to add to that, and like in this demo, we used ADP, who ended up sending the email themselves. So, yeah, as I mentioned during the presentation, these are, let's say, non-deterministic, asynchronous processes. So there is a chance that they fail, but that's also why we make sure to do this authentication as the first thing. So if it does fail, you have different retry mechanisms to try again. And occasionally it does fail, but if we see it failing to receive the email, that's not a test failure. That's a failure to receive the email, which indicates that we should probably just rerun the test.
Excellent. Thanks for the additional context, Brian. We have another question from the audience around how you handled cy.session. So I'm going to share that. How does cy.session handle session persistence across multiple tests? And are there any best practices you all would recommend to avoid test dependency on session state?
So here are two things we do, right? So we also use a cache session flag. Not all tests requires to be cached, right? Like a couple of accounts that we use are just one-time login, right? So if this is set to false, it doesn't cache the session. But otherwise, we just simply use cy.session. Regarding best practices, the validate option is optional. It's not mandatory. I recommend using validate session because sometimes if your test is taking longer to run, right, the session invalidates somehow. And in that case, the session won't be recreated and your test will just stop running, right? And throw the failures. So use validate option. I think would be the number one best practice I can suggest. Another one would be to cache across specs, right? Mm-hmm. So if you don't use this for each spec, it will create a session and then cache it. But if you enable this, it will cache across the spec, right? So it will just do once, and no matter how many specs are running on that machine, it will cache the session and restore it. So I think those are the two things I would do. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think we're going to have time for one more question here. So I'm going to go ahead and share that to the screen. How do you solve for scalability problems with Mailosaur, given identity and auth for big orgs is a scalability problem?
What in terms of scalability, like some more context here?
Yeah, and I think maybe talking a little bit about like if there are any challenges you all have faced implementing this as your test suite has grown. Has it been pretty seamless? I think that's kind of the direction we're going.
It's very seamless. We have never faced an issue. Again, right, as I said, we are using sessions. Like we have like 85 tests in one suite. It just logins once or twice, right? Depending on how many machines we are running it. Never faced an issue. It's super quick. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much to both of you for sharing your expertise with us and walking us through this demo. I think this was super helpful to see how you can implement testing of these types of workflows.